In this second session, we will focus on composition, pedagogy, and working in the industry. As I mentioned in the previous session, or if you are just now joining us, we invite attendees to ask questions throughout the event using our Q&A feature. If you would like to ask a question live, please let us know in the Q&A so that we can unmute you. We cannot guarantee that we will be able to answer all the questions live, but we will certainly do our best to address them. If a question is posted in the chat, there is a chance we may not see it, so please use the Q&A feature. To kick off our second session, I invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves to our audience. I will name each one of you out so you can introduce yourself. Let's begin with Bruce Broughton.
Hi, I can see I'm older than all of you by about 40 years, so that'll be interesting. Yeah, I'm a composer. I've been a composer most of my life. Most of my work was done in film and television. I have a little bit of experience in games. I've got a lot of experience in theme parks, in animation, all sorts of music, as well as concert music. So I do a little bit of teaching, I do a lot of writing, and I do a lot of listening. So I'm curious to know what I'm going to be listening to in the next hour.
Wonderful. Next, we'll go with Richard Vreeland.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rich Vreeland. I make music and sound and music technology type projects under the name Disasterpiece. I've been working in that space for about 15 years, primarily in games, but also feature films, a little bit of television, a little bit of theater, and just generally interested in music and sound and technology.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Next, we'll go with Mellow.
Hi, my name's Mellow. I'm a game composer and occasional sound designer. I've been making music for about 18 or 19 years, but I got into the game industry in 2013 and I've been working on games since then.
That's awesome. Dylan Ray.
Hey, my name is Dylan Ray, and I am the eSport coordinator for UNT, and I've also been an avid sound designer for many years, and I'm the audio director for Lordbound, a Skyrim mod.
Wonderful. Next, we'll do a second introduction of Blaine Brubaker.
Hello again. I hope you can hear me. Changed headphones. My name is Blaine Brubaker. I am the Music Access Services Manager here at UNT. It's exciting to be here with everyone, and I am super excited just to be able to chat and get to know everybody and get to hear about your lives a little bit more.
Wonderful. Next, we have Joshua Cassette.
Hey everybody, my name is Joshua Cassette. I am currently a master's student at the University of North Texas, studying jazz composition with a related field in composition for media arts, which pertains to film, documentaries, TV, and video game music. And I'm really excited to be a part of this panel today.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And then I'm Sabino Fernandez. I am the Music Library Student Assistant Lead for Music Access Services and Music Processing. Thank you all for agreeing to participate in our discussion on video game music and sound design. I will now hand things over to our next moderator, Blaine Brubaker.
And before we continue, I would like to introduce another one of our composer sound designers on the panel today, and that is Ellie Rainsberry. Ellie, go ahead.
Just because I'm new here. My name is Ellie Rainsberry. I'm a composer and sound artist from the UK. I've been mostly making things for games for the last 5 years or so pretty new kind of still in a way, but I've been making things for short films and animations as well over the last like 5 to 10 years or so.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our second session. As Sabina already mentioned, this session is going to be on getting into the video game music industry, breaking in, discussing how you compose, how you create sound, and also talking a little bit about pedagogy. So for my first question, I'd really like to just hear about how you learn to compose for media, for all kinds of different media, and it would be cool to hear, did you go to school for it? Did you learn? Are you self-taught, etc.? You can feel free to jump in. I do not have any experience composing for video games, so I'll add that.
On this, because my history goes a long way back. When I went to school, there were very few opportunities for composers to work in any sort of commercial music other than movies, television, and maybe arranging, meaning bands, song arranging. I went to USC, and there was a film composer, David Raxin, who had written a very famous song for a famous movie, who gave a class. Miklos Rocha, the famous composer, he was on the list of composers, but in fact, he never showed up, so he never gave a class. So there was David. I took David's class. USC at that time had, and still has, a very good cinema school. I went to the same year as George Lucas and John Milius, guys like that. So the years that I was at USC were pretty good years in the cinema school. And so I did one or two films, I think, for student films in the cinema school. After that, I got a job. I was lucky. I got a job working for CBS Television. So I learned a lot about television. And as I stayed in television, my projects got bigger and bigger, and I became, as a result, better known. As I became better known, I got better jobs. And that's an important thing, actually, I think, in anybody's career, that somebody has to get to know you. You can give somebody music cold, but when they hire you, they're basically hiring you, because a lot of people write music, and sometimes the people that you're working for can't tell the difference between you or anybody else, but they can tell the difference between you and somebody else in terms of how you are to them. So my projects in television got bigger and bigger and better, and I eventually got into features. And then I got a call to do a thing for Disney, a theme park thing. And that turned out to be great, because it turned out I really enjoy theme parks. And again, I met a whole new group of people, and that got me into a completely different world, which was running at the same time as I was still doing television and features. Because of the features, I got a call from Virgin Games to do this thing, Heart of Darkness, which is a game from years and years and years ago. Very different from the kinds of things that you guys are doing now. It was basically a film. It was a 30-minute animated thing that had sequences, and each sequence had music. We recorded it in London with an orchestra. It was all live, and I've never seen the game from beginning to end. I don't play games, and I understand that's a really hard game, and a lot of people didn't get to the end, but basically, the things that I did were the main parts of the story, and then the sequence would end, and then it would go to the game part, and you had to survive the game part in order to get to the next sequence. Since then, games have become very, very, very different. But I guess I'll close it with here, just saying that the way that I got into it, and all the things I've ever done in my life, is just basically by getting into one group of people that would introduce me to another group of people. And the more work I did, the more my work became well known by other people, and they would take a chance on hiring me. So I've had a really great time as a composer. I still have a great time as a composer, and I've done tons of things. But it's always been like that. There's always been some people, some human connection that has led me from one to the other. And that's my story.
That's awesome, Bruce. I saw Mellow get so excited for Heart of Darkness. Mellow, would you like to jump in and talk a little bit about your experience in the industry?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Heart of Darkness. It was a precious game to me and my brothers growing up. And don't worry, I beat it 10 times. So I've heard all your music. And now I can't finish the games that I work on because they're too hard. So I understand. Anyway, I made music for about 12 years before getting a chance to make it for games. And for some reason, I never really thought about, here's this hobby that I enjoy, and why don't I create for that? because I never had the chance and I didn't even know how people started doing that. But I released a remix mixtape of a famous game soundtrack, Chrono Trigger, in 2013. And I had a producer who was putting together a game team email me from that. And after I got that opportunity, I started doing a lot of active listening with any game I was playing, and figuring out, okay, how do people actually make these things and how did people make these things? So I learned about the common tools like synths and the different chips inside of old systems. Particularly, the team I was working with wanted me to use the chip that was in the Sega CD. So I had to learn about that and learn how to use that. And for like 3 or 4 months, it was really hard for me to make a good song, because I was transitioning from not ever having done this for money even to having to make something for someone and have it be the thing they wanted rather than the thing I would just habitually do. But once I finally made that one song where they said, okay, this is it, this is the sound we're looking for, I could just crank them out from there, honestly. But I did have quite a gap there because I was never taught composition. I had to learn on my own. And I actually learned the word pedagogy before, like yesterday, before doing this talk. So this is a big Thursday for me. It's a big day. That's all.
Hey, that's awesome. We always learn cool new things from like each other and so on. Ellie, you worked with Mellow on If Found, right? Would you talk a little bit about your experience in the field and breaking into the field?
Yeah, sure. I mean, however, can be considered like breaking because there's just like so many ways to like be able to do that depending on like the access that you kind of have at the time. I was really fortunate to be able to just be in like the kind of right kind of time and spaces to get to know the folks that I knew in games and like the local communities I was in. But like this is all, it's still quite recent to me since like I kind of came from more of a background of doing a lot of instrumentation work. I was initially like still I'm a guitarist, and I initially wanted to get into session work, just generally playing, until I kind of realized that composing, thanks to the mentorship that I kind of got at the colleges that I was going in, really kind of inspired me to just work with other people and just like find more kind of collaborative things to do in music. That's kind of why I kind of strive to like just work with different kinds of people like that, and is why I kind of went into more films and different kinds of media initially anyway. So yeah, as I went into like university, I kind of specialized more in composing, and I wasn't like restricted to like electronic work stuff. I did a lot of ensemble work and jazz kind of compositions as well, and progressive stuff. And then yeah, I in like the master's course I did like a sonic arts masters or sound art masters at Goldsmiths in London, and that was kind of where I started to like experiment more with just doing more kind of interactive experiences. And that was when I was lucky to be able to move to London. I kind of just got myself more involved in the communities that were in London and the small kind of events that was happening. And yeah, I think just from there I got to like meet folks and naturally just like kind of wormed my way into the kind of spaces, I suppose. So yeah, it's a bit more based on communities, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. So I have another thing. So for indie, like indie games, I know Rich has worked on some indie games too. And I want to hear a little bit from Rich. Rich, a good friend of mine, wrote her thesis on your composition for It Found. What is it? It Follows. That's the name of the movie. And she was super excited. And she was the one who introduced me to your music. I'd like to hear about how you broke into the industry and a little bit more about that.
Sure. So my story is a little bit strange. Initially, I was really interested in graphic design. My mom was a graphic designer, and so I kind of grew up around that. I grew up around music too, but visual art was kind of my first interest. My sister was really into music. There was a lot of music all the time in my household, so I kind of like wanted to escape and do my own thing. So I didn't really get into music until late high school. And so I was already on a career track to become a graphic designer. I worked at website companies. I started doing freelance work when I was like 13, just for like other kids, because I was involved in this. I was involved in this thing called e-wrestling, which is like, it's like fan fiction, competitive fan fiction, where you make your own characters. And it was this whole community of people in like the late 90s. So when I was like 13 years old, I was getting checks in the mail from like Malta and random places because I was doing graphics and websites for other kids. And my mom was like, where's this money coming from? But anyway, I went to college for graphic design, but I was all the more getting more interested in music. Decided to drop out to do music, and I decided to drop out of school and go to music school instead. I was starting to write music. Someone posted some of my music on a message board, an e-wrestling message board. And it was actually in response to someone had posted a wanted ad, a cell phone, a company that made cell phone games posted a wanted ad on an e-wrestling message board. And this is how I started working on music for games. It's super random. It wasn't even in my purview before that. I was interested in games and music and was involved in some video game remix communities back in like the early 2000s, like the Shiz, like the Mini Bosses message board and VG Mix and all this kind of stuff, Metroid Metal. What ended up happening, I was able to have a couple of opportunities writing music for cell phone games pre-smartphones. The games didn't turn out so great, but the actual experience of writing music and getting paid was pretty cool as like a 19, 20-year-old. So I was definitely intrigued by that. And so I just sort of started to think about that more as a possibility. And I was fortunate enough to go to Berklee College of Music. And so there was a really good community there. And there were some people who were interested in the same things as I was. And there was a video game music club there, got involved with that club, started hearing about internships, at the same time I was releasing my own original music online, getting involved in the chiptune community, sort of the community of people using retro video game hardware to make music or to emulate those sounds. And I started doing live performance. So I had all these things going at the same time. I was doing live performance in the Northeast in the United States. Like, I was probably doing like 20 shows a year or something like that. Then I was also, in college doing internships. I went to a game developers conference with college loan money. I was just trying to do all these different things, get involved in different online communities, and just generally try to meet new people, put myself out of my comfort zone. And as a way to kind of just meet new people, get out there. And at some point, all of these sort of disparate things that I was doing, like recording artists type, doing live shows and doing a small, I started doing small like freelance gigs for like casual games. All this stuff, at some point, I just decided to like combine it all into a singular path. And that's sort of the story of how I got into games.
E-wrestling. That is so interesting. I'd never heard about that. See, I'm learning new things. We're all learning new things today. And speaking of e-wrestling, it's kind of a weird tie-in. Dylan, I want to hear from you because you're mostly sound design, but you're also the esports coordinator at UNT. And I want to hear a little bit about not only like your sound design stuff, but I want to hear a little bit about esports and how you think sound and music go together with esports.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I was a little ambitious and I had two dream hobbies of mine throughout my life, I would say. When I was in college, I did a lot of competitive Dota 2 and did the esport thing for a nice long while. I was also doing radio at the time and doing audio editing for like dialogue, sound effects, explosions for radio transitions, but had deep appreciation for music. I can't compose to save my life, and I'm just gonna throw that out there. Like, I am hands down the worst composer in this room right now. Don't ask me to compose anything because I can't. But I really loved, the engineering side of radio, but I love video games. And back in the day, the Dota 2 esports scene in the United States was not this gigantic industry that it is today. And so I was like, well, I like audio editing. I like video games. I want to go to school. And so I went back to school and studied at the University of Colorado, Denver, and to specifically focus on sound design and audio integration. So taking people's awesome compositions and actually artistically placing them in the game where it makes sense, and where everyone's creations kind of pop and take the experience and make it come to life. And I think there in college, I learned to be humble, because I think all the way up until that point I was more or less self-taught. And I think the biggest lesson that I learned was to always shut up and listen to the people that are better than you. And I think that was a really great experience for me. There was just so many awesome mentors and professors there at the University of Colorado Denver that if you put in the work and you're willing to listen to what they have to say, I was definitely set up for success. My wife got a job down here in Texas, so I started, after graduating, started looking for, jobs down here to do sound design for, and then saw the esports job posting. And I was like, this was my dream 5 years ago, like that I thought I'd never, be able to do. And now here I am doing esports again. So I still do sound design on the side, working on a mod project just to keep my chops wet, I guess, because I think good sound design and a lot of this skill set is kind of like I guess singing or playing an instrument. You stop doing it, it most certainly kind of falls off. And so I'm very blessed to be working with some people over across the pond, like some engineers and designers from Coffee Stain Studios, working on a passion project in the world of Skyrim. So just happy to be doing something. But yeah, so I somehow got to do both. I guess is where I'm at. So I guess that's my story as far as how I learned to do sound design and also esports.
Excellent. So now we've kind of gone around the room and shared a little bit about our experiences. I'm going to throw out a question here for everybody, and anybody can just hop on this question. And it's, sound and music in video games play a really crucial role in telling a story. And when you have a bunch of people working together, whether that be a sound designer or, a composer coming together, this could be for any type of thing, a movie, a theme park ride, a video game. You want to make sure that everybody works together and tells the story, but also has their own individual sound. What kinds of techniques do you employ to unify your sound, but still be there and be present and say, oh yeah, that is this person, etc.?
It's interesting because in my experience, there are a lot of different ways that you can approach this. Like as one example on Hyperlight Drifter, I did all the music and ambiences, and my friend Akash Thakar did the sound design, and we did not collaborate at all. We barely talked about the game while we were working on it, but we both interacted with the creative director, Alex, and Alex sort of like, I wouldn't say managed, but we had separate sort of relationships with him, as opposed to sort of like cross-pollinating. And in my experience, if you separate the ambient, if you have the music and the ambience kind of done over here, and you have the more tactile sounds done over here, that's one of many obviously ways that you could go about it. That's the way that I worked on Hyperlight Drifter and Fez. So on Hyperlight Drifter was actually sort of piggybacking off of what we did on Fez. I felt that doing all of the music, because the music in those games is very ambient, and because the sounds of atmospheres, it's kind of an airy if you think about it, as far as like the sound of footsteps and objects and interactions being more tactile, the sound of atmospheres tends to be more air based, and a lot of the music was kind of air based, and so that was just like one example of an approach that worked pretty well for us.
Well, Ellie and I actually worked on If Found in this capacity, but it was even more separated, in which we were making music for like literal different sections of the game. So it was a lot easier to do it because we could each like establish our own, like, this is how this part is going to sound. And similarly, we both talked to the creative director. And there were there was one case near the end of the game where I made something that you weren't quite expecting, or it wasn't the way you would have scored it, which was the end sequence where I was like, I'm going to throw some break beats into this. And I just hope your gentle paper sounds work combined with these break beats, these beautiful paper Foley, because I need these break beats. And but when I played the final game, it was amazing how everything came together and worked, and our volume levels worked. And actually, for one of the last songs, I also took your sounds and remixed it, like sampled your guitar into the song. But I'll let you talk now.
I was actually wondering, I did wonder, like, did anything even, like, because I did pass on, like, a lot of the ambience kind of samples I made for If Found over to Matt. But I think, like, they were set up so well. And yeah, I ended up doing, like, quite a contrasting approach with the music that I did for If Found. So yeah, whilst Matt was focusing on kind of like the main story beats, I focused a lot more on kind of the interludes, and I basically just had various arrangements of mostly kind of acoustic instruments kind of stretched out and kind of phasing in and out depending on how you erase parts of the stories and illustrations. And it was really interesting to be able to like kind of like arrange the layers like to make them a bit more grander or minimal depending on what's kind of being reflected in the story. So like having like say like a quiet kind of like depiction of something happening would be a lot more minimal in sound, and having it a bit wider as you conclude, for example. So yeah, it's really fun to be able to like do that sort of thing. And also like on top of narrative, I like moving a bit separately along to If Found, I think a lot about where I am both mentally and in place compared to like the story as means to like emphasize the points the best I can, because I feel like when they write about their experiences and seeing like how best I can like empathize with what they're kind of going through is where I feel like how I execute the work is the strongest. So the current games I'm working on both reflect on those sorts of things, and they're kind of working through, say, like topics like identity and how they feel in certain places and spaces and how to move onwards. And like we sometimes make references in like the playlists that we kind of make, and we I'll just imagine that the most part there'll be music that they'll be listening to and even making the game, but mostly when they're kind of going through the experiences. And I think a lot about that as I like approach the kind of music and sounds in that way as well. And I hope like that kind of gives what I make a bit more depth to what I want to make.
Yeah, it's interesting, the story component, because you made stuff for I made stuff for the segments where it was like vibes, and you could hear a little bit of internal thoughts, but it was mostly conversations and like things happening. But yours were these notebook sections where the main character Cassio just pours out her feelings, and it's a lot more contemplative and a different energy. So
Yeah, and like to explore Cassio's like struggle and trying to have her family understand her life and, and try, to accept her. And the music I found just really helped with that narrative. Bruce, I have a question for you. Speaking of narrative, and with theme park music, because theme park music or ride attractions, they also can tell a story, and they have like specific musical cues with that. Is there anything you think about when composing for theme park rides and the narrative of the ride?
I've done a bunch of theme park shows, and they've basically all been different. Some of them have been films, some of them have been rides, some of them have been walkthroughs. So the demands of the music are pretty different. Like one of the shows I did was Spaceship Earth, which is the one that's in the Epcot ball, and that one was basically to provide sound that had to do with the historical age that we were passing through. Okay, so if we were doing Phoenicia or ancient Rome or the Reformation or something like that, the music had to do with that. The one thing, after the show was done and after it was installed, I wrote it, and I realized that I had overlooked one thing, which was really important. It was the sound of the tram, because the tram that carries you through is so noisy that every time I did something quiet, it would get crushed. So if I were to do a show like that again, one of the things I would do is I would take in, this is going to lead to a question, because I've got a question based on what you were just talking about. I would have to take in all of the sound in the room, because now the music is filling up a space, along with some sound effects, but with the actual sound of people moving through the room. So this is the question I have for you guys. Like Dylan, you were interesting to me because you said you don't compose. I've found over the last several years, particularly about the last 20 years or so, that what we used to call sound effects has become more and more sound design. And where we used to have screaming battles, literally, on the dubbing stage about, can you turn those friggin' effects down? I can't hear my music, or, my effects, or whatever it is. There are oftentimes when sound design has become so sophisticated, where it really does get confusing with the music, because the music's gotten sophisticated too, since we don't all use acoustical media anymore. We're using a lot of synthesizers and a lot of samplers and things. The only guy I know who has successfully, and there may be other guys, but this is the one I've noticed, who successfully used sound design as score was Johan Johansson. And some of the things that he did, I remember one piece, what is it, is Arrival? Is that the one with the spaceship that comes in? Okay, Arrival. I think there were about 5 musical notes in that entire score. I thought the score worked great, but it to me was like 90% sound design. And I thought, if I were 20 years old, if I were as young as some of you are, or younger, and I were just going to music, and I had the presence of mind to know this, I would go into sound design as a form of composition, because this is the way that people actually hear music, and they feel it. So when you're working on these games, are there always these two groups, of the person who's in charge of the score, such as it is, and the other person who's in charge of the sound design? And then you kind of have to hope, like we have in the movies, that they're going to work together? Or do you ever have one person like a Johansson, who can do the entire friggin' thing, and you don't have to worry about what the guy's doing in the next room? Anybody can answer this one, because I'm really curious about the answer.
I think it entirely depends on the project that you're working on, especially with like a smaller scale project where it's just one person. That the beauty of working in an indie project is that you are the driver and the passenger seat rider all at the same time, and so you can decide what is going to work and what is not going to work. But I think oftentimes, especially as you get into larger and larger projects, you are going to have a composer, you're going to have a sound designer, and if you're on a big enough project, you have audio directors that take both pieces and bring them together. And I think one of the more challenging games to do that on are open world exploration games, because the narrative is so undirected most of the time, that you kind of have to constantly think about, well, is the character, like running across the countryside, what should they be experiencing? Should they be experiencing, this kind of louder exploration music to really get them in the groove of what they're doing, or are they about to encounter a story moment where we're going to have to duck some of the music, bring up dialogue, or are we in combat where the sound effects really need to be turned up, music needs to be there to be like, all right, we're in an action sequence, but you still need to hear the bullets that are whizzing by you, or whatever that's going on. I think I would say like open world are probably the hardest ones to do, but I think the tools that are at the implementers and the directors hands these days are very powerful, to be able to take entire mixes like in Wise and duck certain aspects of the mix, because you have something that the audio programmer is like, hey, this is really important, we're gonna bring the music up because we have an emotional moment in this dialogue sequence, right? So they have the tools to take your score and have it prepped for when it needs to be most emotionally impactful, and when it makes sense for it to fade back into the immersive mix, I guess if you could call it, where it kind of fades back into the background. And so that's kind of what I've experienced with the projects that I've been a part of. And so I've like right now I'm blessed to be the leader of the project that I'm currently on, but I've been the sound designer of many projects where I give all my stuff to somebody and then they make the big brain decisions of what to do with it. But they tell me what frequencies to avoid, and I think that's probably the most helpful as a sound designer. But kind of bouncing off of something that you had said, Bruce, that made me immediately think of like sound design as composition. I highly recommend you check out the movie No Country for Old Men, because the score of that movie is amazing and it's all done with wind. It's really cool.
Yeah, but that one wasn't as impressive to me as The Arrival, because
It's true.
that one was so subtle that you really, I mean, it hardly made any, whatever the sound was, it hardly made any effect on you. Whereas Arrival really caught you up like a traditional film score, but it also used all those sound elements.
Yeah.
The thing I find frustrating about this is that we really do have a lot of, I don't want to say screaming battles, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on during the dubbing between one person's area and the other person's area. And egos get bruised and all that kind of stuff, It makes more sense to me, particularly since all of this is much more collaborative than it was, let's say, 10 years ago, that whoever the groups were would work together on a single track. So you didn't have to decide to dump that or bring this up. You would integrate the whole thing like it used to be done with scores like 50 years ago or 60 years ago. The old scores, that was the music, and the sound effects were not particularly important. Now it's all important. And I think sound design is just so friggin' interesting because it has no top, that you can use it emotionally like that, but to use it as just a section and the music guy is going to do the other stuff, to me is really kind of dangerous, because the music guy may not do it, or the sound guy may not do it, I mean, I'm still interested to hear everybody else's response.
Yeah, I would say like as far as like contemporary opportunities go for composition, the tools are as versatile as they've ever been, and a lot of people come up learning how to do sound design and music in tandem. I mean, that's always the way that I've worked. I've always, like, composition, I'll sit at the piano and come up with ideas from from time to time, but a lot of the work that I do is one-to-one between building sound palette, sound world, doing production, and doing composition. So just as a byproduct of that process, it's very easy for the lines between sound design and music to get blurred. I think about, I did a horror film called It Follows a couple years ago, and when I was working on that, there wasn't a ton of sound design, abstract sound design that had been done for the film. And so there was a lot of opportunities to kind of fill in that element of the sound palette for the film. And it just became a sort of a natural part of the way that I worked on that project when I was writing cues, especially because it was a synth score. And that's my background is using synthesizers. So I just filled in whatever I felt like a scene required. And so, a lot of those cues, they're musical, but they're also horror sound effects and horror sound design. And it's all integrated into kind of a singular, like, hodgepodge. I think, those opportunities, when you have an opportunity to do that, it can feel really integrated and really tight and strong, but it kind of depends on, it's like the difference between having one opportunity to do something. It could be really good, it could be not so good. If you have a bunch of different people working on things like in parallel, I mean, that obviously that brings more complexity to the way that you are going to approach something. Personally, I find it really interesting to kind of like play with those boundaries and see how you can make it all into this sort of like soupy kind of like sound expression for what you're working on.
Yeah, I wanted to say with regards to the screaming battles, now that we have programs like Unity where we all work together using a Git repository, you can actually just go in and delete the sound designer's files completely. And that makes it more of a crying alone thing rather than a screaming battle. But on my first game that I ever worked on, Read Only Memories, it actually didn't have a sound designer. So it was a similar situation to Rich, where they just asked me if I could do stuff, and I did. I'm not a sound designer still by any means, but I did try to make sounds with synths for that game, and it did complement the soundtrack well. But what I've found in video games is it's such a particular skill set for sound design, because it has to be really tactile. Like especially for action games, when the player is interacting as this character, like whether it's jumping or hitting something, it has to really feel good. And I think the need for this makes the sound designers working in games so good at picking up on that feel. And I often find that they hear the music and figure out what will work and what won't work over that, like really well on their own. And sometimes as a composer, I almost feel like I don't have to do anything, and I just go in and I look and it's beautiful, and that's it. Like, and that's why I don't work as a sound designer anymore, because it's not beautiful. I don't have the skill set, but I am practicing where I can on games where people do let me do the sound design. So hopefully someday I'll be able to get that tactile feel that impresses me so much.
Yeah, I feel like it's more or less had become like a common hearsay when I was like initially kind of like starting composing for media, that I was like, oh, it seemed like a lot of folks are either looking for mostly one person to be like an overall audio kind of designer, mostly because of like they might not have like the budget for the most part, and as a way, I kind of had to end up like kind of self-teaching myself sound design. And I think like I'd imagine with most folks who might be suddenly experimenting, I did like go through like a lot of like kind of Creative Commons sounds to just like make my own kind of experimentations with it. But I think since I came from a more musical heavy background, and I've always usually just solely make music, I really feel like I kind of grew more from designing sounds and kind of like trying to incorporate music into the sounds as well, and trying to like kind of make more creative sound design as a result. With one of the games that I've been working on, for example, I've been like using some bits that I've picked up where I'm kind of just using some like soundscapes as a way to kind of like experiment with like reverberations and kind of taking like the more tonal aspects of those sounds and making them into their own kind of like musical palettes. And that was part of the way that I was able to shape like the sounds of a particularly like core part of like one of the games that I've been on. So yeah, it's definitely like something that I'd encourage like folks to experiment with if possible, but it's okay to like be able to like focus on the one thing if you're able to. Like I do like admire like whoever is able to like kind of combine the music and ambiences like all together.
And this idea of like sound design versus composition or them coming together is super interesting, because over the past week I played a lot of games and I tried to watch clips of movies to like remind myself what things sounded like and what was going on in the background. So for example, I downloaded the game, what is it called, Bird Alone? I think Ellie worked on that one.
I know that one.
Yeah. And then I also played If Found. I watched some clips of Silverado. That was one of my dad's favorite movies while I was growing up, so I've seen that many times. Good old Jeff Goldblum in that. As my postcard back here has him on it. And then I also played a lot of Hyper Light Drifter and got angry at myself. But as the week went on and I revisited a lot of these games and these movies and these media, you know, a thought came to mind of like, do we want to think of sound design and composition as versus each other or going hand in hand? And I think that when we think of different genres too, or even different platforms such as cell phone or console or PC, that maybe sometimes we think about composing in different ways. One of our attendees, Kinley, asked, how does composing for video games differ from composing for other types of media? And does the level of interactivity, change your approach in how you compose for video games or media in general, really?
Well, I'd say it's dynamic music is the main difference for me, is having to create layers, having to have something evolve, having music that's flexible enough where whether the player's staying in the same spot for many minutes or moving forward as quickly as possible through the game, you can't break the immersion. They can never hear like the awkward parts when you're fading something. And actually, when I play games that I know have dynamic music, I sometimes try to break it for fun, because if I can break it, then I can see how they did it and then I can learn,
Yeah, I think the fact that when you're writing music for games, there's sort of these other hats that you're inclined to wear. One of which is doing quality assurance testing for the music, because not only are you writing music for the experience, although this is not always the case, a lot of folks will implement their own music. So there's the testing of how the music behaves, the nonlinear variety of the experience for players, how long they spend different areas, different contexts. But the fact that you kind of, for the most part, you're not only creating music, you're creating some kind of system, some sort of interactive system that has multiple states. And so it's a big consideration. It also changes the way that you develop the material, because the timelines for production are very different in a game than they are in a film. Usually the timelines, not all the time, but a lot of times the timeline for a film can be somewhat compressed, and the structure of the thing that you're working on when you get to the point where you're required to do music is usually fairly, it's fairly solidified. You may have some things that you have to work with as far as editing your music to updates to the different cuts. And so there's a little bit of a battle there, but on a game, the fundamental nature of a game can be changing through a large swath of the project. And so it can feel a little bit like someone's constantly pulling a rug out from underneath you. And so it can be hard. Like the thing that I always struggle with is like when I feel like is the most appropriate time that I need to like clamp down and really get serious about the project and devote all of my time to trying to commit myself to creating like fully realized work. If the game is having an identity crisis, it's hard to feel confident in the work that you're doing. With linear media, that's often less of a problem because it's so front loaded with production work. I mean, if you're doing a live action film of some kind, there's so much work that goes into that. It's pretty much established. It pretty much has its identity already. I mean, they're going to edit things, you know, and whatnot. But compared to games, games are there's just more. It's harder to foresee how things are going to unfold. It's more unpredictable and chaotic. I think the technology by its very nature is much more prone to things just going awry. And so also the timelines of projects tend to get stretched out far longer. You know, there's sort of the idea that however long you think something's going to take, it's probably going to take twice as long. I think in games, it's usually like 4 times as long in my experience. A lot of times I've been on a project that was supposed to take, you know, a year and it ended up taking 4. So these are all things that make working on a movie a lot more like paint by numbers, even though it has its own challenges. But compared to, I mean, games are it's such a burn. It's sometimes, you know, it tends to be more of a slow burn than a film can be. Film can be kind of, you know, intense and, you know, very compressed as far as time schedules go. But that's been my experience, at least.
I'd say you're right. Doing movies is like paint by numbers because you do what's there, what's called for. You know, it's like I tell people when I do these talks about movies that a composer who's working on a movie literally knows the length of every note that he or she's writing, because it has to be that long. If it's too long or it's too short, it's not going to match the scene. The thing that's actually affected movies a lot has been digital technology, in that editing is being done now very quickly. Editing can be done within a few seconds, whereas it used to take hours. And so the style of music that's more effective now is that minimalistic kind of stuff, the kind of stuff that Hans Zimmer will put out over the kind of stuff that John Williams will put out. Because if you write like John Williams and you have to cut out 3 seconds on the fly, that's hard. To cut out 3 seconds of Hans isn't so hard, because he'll keep in the same key. And that's not to say that one music is better than the other. It's just the styles have changed a lot. The same thing I would say, just to go back to the question about what do you call it? Theme parks. Theme parks generally are not movies. Generally, they're experiences. So you're either playing a general background, in which case you don't have to be very specific, and it's a little game-like, or you're playing in something that's just putting you in a situation. You know, it's much more atmospheric. This kind of stuff is a lot more interesting to me because things happen very quickly and it's unpredictable and it's up to the player. And so then the music has to change and it has to be there for them. You know, the other stuff, the paint by numbers stuff, it's a little easier.
Yeah, absolutely. This is super interesting. I'm learning so much. Josh, since you're on here too, you're wanting to answer that one question about recording and editing software. And as a composer yourself who's worked in media and whatnot, what software do you use?
Well, for music notation, usually I use Sibelius exclusively for that. But for digital audio workstations or DAWs, I have used Reaper and Pro Tools, but I'm currently have switched over to Cubase, and I'm finding the experience is really great. A lot of professionals actually use Cubase. Reaper is a great program. A lot of video game composers and also sound designers use Reaper because of its user interface is actually really great. So, and it's not so complicated to figure out how to use it. It's also not a memory hog like Pro Tools. So you need like 32 gigabytes of RAM just to run Pro Tools.
It's also cheap
Yes.
and really, really reasonable.
Yes, I would.
There's
agree.
a lot of tools out now, and you know, you can kind of try them all and see what works best. You can get good results with lots of different tools.
Yeah, like I think like the fact that there's so much more access given to like what you can kind of like experiment with really helps kind of widen what you kind of want to do. And like I think like it's a bit difficult to like recommend like, oh, what would be the superior kind of DAW or software to use, because it's like just really dependent on like what access you are given at the time, like what is sort of at your devices at the time. Because like I use Logic, say, and that's was mostly like one of the only available like softwares that I could pick up through the college that I was doing, and I kind of just ended up solidifying kind of just like my practice through that. And it's just like a bit more worthwhile to just focus on what you're like most strongest and confident with, as opposed to like picking up something just for the sake of like what others might want to do or something.
Yeah, if you've been using the same DAW for a while, you get really fast at using it. And so I've been using Logic 2 for a long time, and I've often thought, oh, I would love to like get into Ableton because Ableton seems really cool, but I just don't. It would take me a really long time to get even remotely as good at Ableton as I am at Logic. So it's like, is it even worth it? I don't know. I mean, am I more interested in making stuff or like, you know, like doing tool tourism? Like I think I'm a little bit more interested in making stuff. So.
It's funny, I actually got Ableton not long ago just to like just to like practice like different kind of stuff, because like yeah, if you're like able to like access or like afford just trying new stuff just to see if something works for you, then like yeah, like absolutely go for it, because like I do want to like experiment doing more non-linear composition, which I know you could probably do in Logic, but what was appealing for me with Ableton is being able to work with Max again, and I did like a lot more kind of like Max and Pure Data kind of stuff during my master's degree, and I kind of missed doing that and incorporating that more into my practice. But yeah, like it's definitely like similar to what Rich was saying, like you'll get like super familiar enough with something that you'll just be like able to get things out more quicker and more comfortable as well. Like put your comfort first, like above like how like you can afford the best kind of software, honestly.
I would probably say there isn't a standard. It's whatever you're most comfortable working with. Like when I worked Pro Tools, it was a pain to figure out how to work everything, and then just try to make sure it's stable. When I got Reaper, it was so easy to figure out. Now Cubase, it's a little bit more technical, but it's really nice to actually dive into something like that. So it's whatever you're most comfortable with, as they're saying. But yeah, I would say if you choose a program, stick with it, because it's not good to bounce around once you learn a little bit of it and then move on to another one, because you're not going to become as proficient, you know, unless like you're scaling up as you would see as an opinion. So
one thing I would say is that the more, for better or worse, like the more you're going to be working in like recording studios with corporations, any sort of large scale projects, and the more that you're dealing with like more on the technical side, like mixing, engineering, all this kind of stuff, the more likely you're gonna have to know how to use Pro Tools. Personally, I hate Pro Tools, and so every once in a while, I'm just kind of like forced to like get it for like a month so that I can put something in like the format that's required of me. So, you know, if you're, yeah, it's that's one of the few that I would say is like it's pretty much an industry standard, and it's hard to get away from that if you're trying to work within some kind of system. If you're just like doing music, it doesn't matter, or just, you know, on your own, then, you know, have fun.
We have another question about tools and ways to create music. So what degree do virtual instruments play a role in your compositions? And assuming that you are able to write with musical notation, which, you know, not all of us aren't, what are the pros and cons for using musical notation as opposed to being like a MIDI composer or someone who just does it by sound?
So personally, I find that music notation doesn't serve any purpose unless you're intending to have other people play the music. That's just me personally, because I'm not, reading music is not a strength of mine. It's something that I can do, but I'm pretty slow. Like I sight read at like, I don't know, a quarter of the speed that I'm supposed to. Yeah, it just becomes another layer of abstraction, right? Because it's, notation is just a construct. It's just another way of like explaining music. If the end result of what you're doing is recorded pieces of audio and production, and I mean, even working with musicians sometimes, depending on what the prompts are, what you're expecting from them, like if you're giving them some level of flexibility to do improvisation or whatever, you may not even need notation. But if you're working with an orchestra, ensemble, you have very specific things that you're trying to communicate that you want other players to perform, then notation is, you know, great for that. And also it's fair, you know, pretty standardized, so people know how to read it, and that allows you to interact with some of the most amazing and proficient like musicians on the planet. So it really depends on what you're doing. If you're doing like small independent kind of project or a score that's like in the box, so to speak, in the box, like it's going to be, you know, synths and samples and stuff, you don't really need to bother with it. If you want to work with a musician like a soloist or something, and they, you know, you have a part for them that you specifically want them to play, then it's probably a good idea to give them notation, because that's probably what they're going to be used to.
Yeah, I'm usually only talking to my program and not talking to other musicians. And when I'm talking to my program, it speaks MIDI, so I speak MIDI, and that's how it is pretty much.
Yeah, more or less seconding with everyone else, really. Like, though, like I had worked with a lot more notation-based things when I was doing my undergrad degree, and that was definitely, yeah, beneficial to me in terms of like communicating more concisely with the instrumentalists that I'm working with. And I would like to try and bring it back into my practice some more, as I like want to hopefully collaborate with musicians again sometime. But by default, like I do kind of rely a lot more on my ear in terms of like what I want to like notate down, like in my DAW as well. So it's just been fortunately like a lot more straightforward and quicker way to lay out any ideas that I have.
Even me at my advanced stage, I'm mostly a notation guy, but I agree with Rich, is that it's mostly important, particularly for what you guys are doing, when you want to include other musicians whose performances you rely. Like if you're going to work with a string quartet, good luck on having them improvise off your ideas. But there are some groups that will do that, and if you're tolerant of what you're going to get, that's great too. The thing that I like about working on synths and on electronic stuff, even in notation, is that it's really easy to make mistakes that end up being really interesting because, you know, you find yourself doing something that you didn't intend, or something happens that you didn't intend. You go, oh, that's a cool idea, I can use that. You know, I find that notation is important if there's something that I really, I mean, for me, it's important if there's something I really have to work out musically. But most of my work is done with acoustic stuff. But in general, I think Rich is right. I mean, I think you can be really creative and more creative by not being stuck by how you're going to notate the sucker. You know?
Yeah, and Lordbound, we have bard songs for like various regions in our game world, where we take some of the existing exploration score and then have an actual NPC play an instrument and like sing along with it. So we had to annotate our songs that were built digitally. Fortunately, there's like Logic has a great tool where you can just export it as annotation, and so we just sent that to the guitarist, and they were able to strum and sing along with the tunes. So there's a lot of great technology out there that can make the transformation between the two very seamless. So
as we talk more about notation and how things have kind of changed, there's notation and then we move away from notation, there's notation, we move away from notation. Mellow, you're going to answer this one, this question that popped up. Anything in particular you would like to see change in the game industry, like music, sound making wise, or just in general?
Yeah, I have a few things, and hopefully everyone has something, but mine primarily would be, I would love to see more people given chances to learn on the job a little bit rather than being evaluated by like what's in their portfolio at the time. I think because I had a very, very valuable experience where I could learn. I learned like directing voice actors. I learned sound design, doing my bad sound design that I don't do anymore. And I learned composition all pretty much on the job. And I was supported by this team in doing it. And I think so often that people will look at a composer's experience rather than just thinking like, well, there's a little bit of something I like here. Let me see if I can help them explore that. Rather, it's like, no, you're just going to be on the job and just be able to do it immediately. And I would like people to be more patient. And I would also like to see in video games, because I think movies, TV, animation has no problem with this. In video games, I would like to see more genres explored because it's mostly electronic or orchestral, I think. And I make jazz and hip hop a lot of the time, and I would love to see that more represented, and also to see more references given for stuff outside video games in general when composers are being hired and brought on, because as musicians we're interested in a lot of things, and it can kind of narrow us down the kinds of inspirations that are drawn on in games over and over again. Kind of narrow everything down and make everything a little too samey.
What's great about I think working on games these days is just that the access to tools and technology is so widespread. And so, if you're fortunate enough to have a little bit of time and some like-minded people to work with, you can kind of make your own thing and do what you want and kind of like bring some of these new ideas to the fold. That's something that I would like to do one day. But I've always thought that was one of the more inspiring elements of sort of games, largely speaking, is how many people I met who was just a person or just two people, maybe didn't have a ton of experience, but were really passionate about an idea that they had, and were able to see it to fruition. Obviously that's can be easier said than done, and there's certain obstacles that can get in your way, but it's one of the nicest elements. The overhead is much lower than like something. I would say it's probably lower than film for sure, as an example.
I think that one of the things, I'm talking a little bit like an outsider right now, because I've listened to a lot of game music. I've only done one thing, and it was a long time ago, so it's not like what you guys are doing. Listening to game music, it sounds like a lot of it is very generic. What I'm hearing is a lot of generic, and because I don't know the game music, I don't have any identification with any of it, and I can't go, oh yeah, I love that piece because it sounds like so and so. When you just listen to it as an outsider like that, and I'm thinking about the orchestral stuff, because I've heard a lot of orchestral performances and stuff. It sounds really generic. And I think the reason for that is because it's sort of an outgrowth of film and television. Just like film and television, television particularly was an outgrowth of what people found in radio. And that stuff was an outgrowth of what they used to listen to on concert stages. So like the early film music was very, very classical. And it's taken a long time to get away from that. Oddly enough, these days, because of streaming in television, there are a lot more creative solutions to scoring because they don't have the budgets, and they do have access to some electronic stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening that's getting to be really interesting. I think with games, to the earlier point that you don't always get a chance to do the stuff that you would like to because you're being hired on your last game. A lot of this has to do with relationships, and you're probably better off doing something brand new if you're working with somebody who you actually have a great relationship with and who trusts you and who you can convince to be of like mind and then let you go with it. If you actually have an idea to do something. I mean, the past is a big pull, but like you guys are all pretty young. You've got lots of ideas and you hear a lot of stuff, and it's very eclectic because there's a lot of music around right now. Like hip hop wasn't around when I was a kid, and when I was around just beginning, there were very few opportunities to do this kind of work at all, to do any kind of commercial work. Now there's a lot of opportunity, and there are a lot of people going through Berkeley, a lot of people going through USC, a lot of people going through UNT, a lot of people going through all these schools. Yeah, I think this one comes down to sort of like to relationships.
I'd like to speak to that a little bit, just because I've been one of the relationships that I have is with this director, David Mitchell, who did It Follows. We also got to work on. I worked on his next film, which is a film noir, totally different style, and I was just fortunate to have a collaborator who really who believed in me as an artist and kind of got what I was about. That I wasn't just like, this person who did this one kind of thing, and that I was interested in kind of exploring different genres and avenues. So, I was able to, he gave me this great opportunity, like, do you want to write for a full orchestra? And I had only really dabbled in that department. And if it wasn't for having that relationship, like, I don't think I would have been given this opportunity to write a mid-century like film noir score. Because there was just nothing in my background that would suggest that that's something, I'd mostly been writing like music inspired by, 80s video game music. So there was very little in my background that would suggest that I would be a good candidate to write like a Bernard Herrmann-esque like film noir score. But that opportunity, having that opportunity to do something like that was such a profound, it was really, really challenging, but a profound learning experience for me. And a lot of it just has to do with being given a shot, kind of piggybacking off of what Bruce and Matt have been saying. So the relationship aspect is really, really important. It's just important in life, I think, in general. You just want to make good relationships with people who you feel like understand you. And that's going to go a long way, I think, in being able to do cool things.
Yeah, I'll more or less like second everyone with like being able to like be given the space to be able to do something different than what would probably be considered the norm for games is really beneficial. Like, I think a lot about how not having heard too much guitar music, for example, in games until I came across like the Swords and Sorcery soundtrack as like one of the first kind of few references I was given by like a collaborator in film that I was working with at the time, and being like, this actually feels like a feasible sort of space to bring myself in. So yeah, I think just from then on out, I've actually like, it's only really in the last couple of years I've been doing kind of more electronic stuff as like a mixture of like, it's kind of like a mix of convenience and like access at the time, because I was like living in spaces where I would find it quite difficult to record in those sorts of spaces as a guitarist, and I've been able to like incorporate that a lot more since I moved outside of the city, which has been really good. And I think in the future I'd really like to be able to have the kind of spaces and resources to work with more kind of open and more niche sort of genres. But one sort of thing I thought about is that like it's not just like it could be one thing like being able to do that with the developers that you work with, but it's also like hopefully be able to find the funding to be able to do the work at all. And it's like it's kind of becomes a bit more broader in terms of like change in industry sort of stuff. But I think about the folks I know sort of experiences with funding bodies, and whilst like they seem to be like, oh, we'd like to help fund your game, a lot of things kind of fall through for like sadly not great kind of reasons, like in the sense that like they may just be like flaky with communication, or like in some folks I know cases like they just like were a bit more deceiving in what they actually want. So I'd really like to see just like more folks worldwide being given a chance to like be able to make the stuff at all, and hopefully just being able to have that access at all would be really nice to see in the future.
Yeah, go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, I think stemming with what Bruce had been talking about how there was a period of time in, and I think it still happens with video game music composition, is the desire to be very film orientated. I love the score of Last of Us, but I can't remember, like I can't think of it. What like the riffs and all that stuff doesn't come to me. But if I mention, I don't know, the Halo theme, like it immediately comes to mind. And I think what recently has been happening that's really exciting for music composition is an indie explosion that's kind of happening over the last couple of years, and a fascination of returning to retro. Because what made I think a lot of the music that we get excited about to talk about was a lot of those retro scores that were built out of technological necessity, and the limitations with those technologies as far as how many notes could be played at one time. The composers had to work really, really hard to work within those technical limitations, and what you got out of it was some really just iconic compositions that are incredibly memorable, that get stuck in your head because they're beautifully simple. There's a reason why Britney Spears gets stuck in your head the moment you start hearing a riff from Britney Spears. Is that a lot of pop music is beautifully simple, and a lot of the game scores in the 90s and the 80s were beautifully simple because they had to be. There was no other choice. They had to be. And so nowadays, with sort of like this return to retro with a lot of games that are coming out, like Stardew Valley is an excellent example of like a return to retro, of the whole score being incredibly minimalistic, but really catchy, at the same time, because of that fascination with older technology that I think was great for video game composition, and in the current age right now.
Yeah, I think once games got more 3D, there tended to be this general push towards incorporating cinematic language into games and kind of getting away from the history and culture of games since their kind of inception. And I think now what you see more of is like the reintegration of the origins of games. Like what's so cool about retro, like the art, like the old game music, is that because of the technical limitations, well, they were also like inspired. There was a lot of that music was inspired by contemporary music of the time, like a lot of the Japanese game music in like the early 80s, mid 80s. A lot of it was inspired by like fusion and jazz and classic rock, and heavy metal. I mean, like Mega Man is like basically it's basically Iron Maiden, the early Mega Man music. A lot of Koji Kono's early music is like inspired by like different genres from around the world. Like samba, bossa nova, fusion, like all this kind of stuff. And what's so cool about that is that because of the technical limitations, it had to be like distilled down into like these very fundamental building blocks. So a lot of that music is like highly contrapuntal and relies a lot on, you know, like progression and rhythm and just like very like just very it's just very essentialized kind of form of music. And there's something really like beautiful about that. And so yeah, it's just, I think because games is still a relatively new medium, like it's just it takes time for it to like kind of mature and like for more things to become integrated into it and for it to really like start to get away from like thinking of itself as some sort of extension of film, because it's obviously it's totally different than that. And there's a lot that you can do with games that you couldn't really do in a movie.
Actually, I want to mention that I think Bruce literally composed the first game soundtrack with a live orchestra, I'm pretty sure, which is very relevant to this conversation. And I wondered like what that conversation was like, having a conversation with a game designer who wanted that.
I can tell you why I got the job. It was done by a bunch of French guys. And I have to say, it was one of the best jobs I ever had because they were working in Paris and I was living in LA. So I'd either go visit them or they'd come visit me. And every time one group would go visit the other group, we'd all have a party. So it was, it was a lot of fun. But the reason they got me was because I had done this movie, The Rescuers Down Under, which was an animated movie that Disney had done. And they really liked the style. So on that particular game, and I say this is a really early game, they were trying to cop the style that Disney had done. They wanted to make it look like an American movie. Now, the funny thing was, I don't think anybody would mistake that as being an American cartoon because you got a very French thing, but they liked the adventure score that the Rescuers had, and they wanted to get the guy who did that. So they called me. What was interesting to it for me was, Rich, this is sort of like your story in that when I was a kid, I didn't want to be a composer. I wanted to be an animator. And so I had a real big interest, and I've always had a really big interest in animation. Whenever I could do animation, which came pretty late into my career, I really just grabbed at it. So to get this to be a game, to be able to use an orchestra and be able to do animation with a whole different group of people and be able to have parties either in France or in LA, I mean, it was a cool gig, But basically it was The Rescuers Down Under. They were trying to do an American movie, so they got the guy who did that.
Yeah. The animation on that game is ridiculous, but did you know that one of the things it's most notable for now is actually the grisly ways that the kid dies in the game?
I like saw that part.
Oh, there are compilations online of like this kid dying in terrible ways, scored by your music. And
one of the criticisms I heard about the game was that it wasn't grim enough it wasn't scary enough for an American audience.
No way. I would have to, when I was playing, and there'd be terrible death sounds, and I would just be, and so my mom didn't hear it because the computer was in the family room and this kid was dying.
On this idea of, and this is going to probably be our last question, we don't have a lot of time left, but I think this is a really important point, and we've had a little bit of chat in the chat box, and our conversations here have really fed into it. But there's a question that asked, Rich mentioned that there are so many tools widely available today as the industry feels even more inaccessible. And like sometimes the industry treats you really badly as an employee. And like, how do you work against that? Or what are some tips to work against that, I guess?
My personal experience has been that the more like complex an organization is that I'm dealing with, the more impersonal the experience is, and the more likely something's going to happen that is going to make me upset. And so I've always tried to gravitate towards building personal relationships and working on projects with smaller groups of people who have more of the power to make the choices that really matter. when you get into these really like hierarchical situations where there's lots of people involved, you don't always know who's in charge, who's making the decisions. Sometimes the creative team doesn't have a very long leash, as I like to call it, and they can't even really protect you because they can barely protect themselves. You know, I've been in situations where, you know, there were like veiled threats that like I was going to be replaced by, you know, Hans Zimmer or something. Like, if I don't know what I had to do differently, but the creative team loved me, like, and thought I was doing a great job. But, you know, like somewhere higher up, someone didn't like me until they, at the very last minute, they decided, oh yeah, it's great, we love it. But, you know, you had to go through like months of torture. So yeah, I mean, I've just tried to lead with kind of the interpersonal stuff. And just through experiences have always tried to pool in with a small group of people, like-minded individuals, who are passionate and who actually have some sort of power, whether whether they're working with like a funding source that's like really cool and giving them a lot of the flexibility, or if it's, you know, maybe there's not a lot of money involved and you're in a position where you can help out anyway. I mean, depending on what your situation is, but just generally, I try to. That's what's worked for me personally.
And it can happen on.
Quote, Hans Zimmer says, "It's really important to know who you're working for." And I mean, and it actually has to do exactly what you were saying, Rich, because sometimes you think you're working for the director or the artistic director, something like that, but you're really not. You're really working for the guy up in the corner office, you know, on the 44th floor.
And actually also in small game teams, the first game team that I worked on actually had a very publicized workplace abuse situation where we all kind of realized we weren't getting paid very much, but we were new. And there was a lot of hostility with the boss, but this was like a 7 to 10 person team. And even then, if you have, there was kind of a narcissistic person at the top of the power structure who would dictate everything and wouldn't really understand the creative process, but would take a lot of inspiration from whatever was making money at the time and kind of force that onto us to say, like, why can't you be like this, without knowing that's just not how it works. So unfortunately, even in indie teams, you have to be careful of working for someone like that. And as for getting better treatment, working as a freelancer with my own contract, where I do things like limiting how many drafts I will do before getting paid extra, or making sure that I keep all the rights to my music where I can really help. But when you are working with those small teams, just to make sure everyone's professional and there is not one person who, I guess, thinks they can make too many decisions on their own.
Excellent. Okay. I want to thank everybody. We're right at time. I want to thank everybody for coming and being here and joining us. Do we have any last thoughts before we go?
Sure. I guess one quick tip of advice when I imagine a lot of people that are tuning in right now are like looking to get into the industry. When you're putting together, you know, your reel or you're starting to apply for jobs, the best piece of advice I got was from Curtis Churn, who is one of the audio directors at Riot Studios. And what he said was, when you're looking to apply to get in the industry, focus on what you can control and focus really hard on that, right? If you're looking to be a composer, work on your compositions. You know, don't sweat like integration or anything like that. Make beautiful music, and that will be your ticket into this industry. If you're looking to be a sound designer, make a really cool 1-minute reel. You know, focus on the things that you can control, and work really hard at it, and good things will follow from there.
It definitely helps too if you're like willing to step out of your comfort zone and just interact with lots of people, even if it's not always pleasant, because of, you know, just because of personally how you are. I mean, I'm pretty, not the most social person, pretty introverted, but I just kind of like I had to kind of force myself to do that, because otherwise I wasn't really going to meet anybody and nobody would know who I was. Fortunately, it's I mean, it can be a little easier. Different ways of communicating can maybe be a little more comfortable for you. You know, maybe certain ways of communicating online can be a little more, a little less intimidating than, you know, like in person, you know, walking up to strangers kind of thing. But and you know, I just I don't know, I always tried to just meet new people and not like just be like, hi, you know, like I'm looking for work, like hire me. Definitely never, don't ever lead with that. You just try to meet people and get to know, you know, make new friends and stuff, and you know, maybe don't come on so strong.
The best advice I never took was learn to play golf.
I need to find some clients who can play golf, who have that kind of money.
But you know, it was actually, the guy was serious. I thought he was joking. And this is before I got hired by anybody. He said, do you play golf? I said, no. I said, learn. I said, why? He said, because golf is a very sociable sport. Again, you know, what Rich was talking about, it's a sociable sport. You're going to meet lots of people playing golf. Producers play golf. And then he said, you're going to meet a producer. You're going to become friends. He's going to invite you over to his house, and he's going to introduce you to his daughter. Date her. He says, that's how people get into the business. And even though he was making a joke, I can tell you that John Williams plays golf, James Newton Howard plays golf. All the musicians that I worked with years ago play golf. I mean, whether you ever learn to play golf or not, it's basically all about people. You got to find ways of, and the thing with lead with what you're good at, that's a good advice too.
Yeah, I think what especially has helped me when I was like kind of figuring stuff out is just always having something available for folks to listen to, like even if it is just like a few tracks online where you meet people, because they will always have just like a point of reference to like get a feel of like who you are as a person first when you're meeting, and then just like have something as a reference as a secondary sort of thing, and that's been really helpful because like I've been really lucky in that like I haven't like I'm gonna feel like a traitor, but I haven't had a reel made at all. I haven't touched my CV in a while either. It's just like really what's available like on an online platform that's like as easy to access as possible as a bare minimum, and that has kind of just been a very helpful sort of thing in terms of just having a reference. And a slightly separate thing is that like in terms of like techniques, in terms of just how to improve in like working and stuff, is that like it's okay to just have like breaks from doing entirely just creative stuff if you want to have time to just like listen more mindfully to the artists that you really like, and like how certain kind of like motifs or movements make you feel, or even just going on like what I typically do is that I sometimes do go on a lot of walks, and being a lot more observant and mindful about the sort of sounds that I'm hearing like really gives like a decent break for what you typically do. So I just wanted to like say like it's okay to do that. You don't have to just be like burning yourself out making like anything.
It's essential. I mean, you have to take breaks. You can't really be good at what you do if you're not giving yourself space to get away from it. I think that it's just a recipe for disaster. So you got to lead with your health as much as you can. Give yourself, you know, you don't want to neglect your relationships or your body or your mind. You have to take care of those things. That's the most important thing.
All right. Well, thank you all for this great discussion on video game music composing and sound design. It's been great. Thank you all for agreeing to do this and agreeing to join us to talk about this area of study and working in the industry, of course. And of course, thank you, Blaine, for moderating this portion of our chats. Keep an eye out for our next First Shirt chat, tentatively scheduled for March 11th. This chat aims to discuss women leaders in music professions to coincide with Women's History Month. I invite everyone to follow the Music Library media pages the Music Library social media page on Facebook, the Media Library on Discord, and the UNT Libraries on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you all attendees for attending our first church chat on video game music and an exploration of ludomusicology and sound design in video games, and have a wonderful rest of your day.